Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Is this working? Hello everyone, welcome to October's reading wrap up. We are deeply in the autumn winter months now as I'm filming this in November. It is 1:30 p.m. and the light is fading fast. It's so grey, and probably by the time you've seen this I will have done some somewhat skillful colour grading so I don't quite look so sallow. I am literally sat in front of the window and you couldn't tell. Anyway, welcome in. Thanks so much for stopping by today. If you're new, my name's Charlotte. I do monthly book reviews and I also have a BookTok account which I'll link in the description box. I have no reading target this year. I thought I'd remove the expectation, and I'm also on a book buying ban. I had quite a hefty reading month this month and I read 9 books, which I was really pleased with. It felt like I was getting through books really quickly. I felt like we were whizzing through them. There was not a reading slump to be had this month. I know off the top of the bat that this is going to be a very long reading wrap up. I typed out notes for most of my books, as I always do, and one of them is so unbelievably long. I'm genuinely dreading editing this, but hopefully it will be really good for you because I know you all love long videos. Most of my books were digital this month, so I had 7 digital, 2 physical. I think that was a huge contributor in how I managed to fly through so many books. A lot of them were done quite early on in the month, which is quite big for me. I usually tend to do a lot of my books towards the end of the month. I take notes, so if you ever see me glancing down, it's just to make sure I capture everything. So I'm going to be kind of reading off the screen. It's just like my rough thoughts. Let's get started. The first book I read in October was a digital book, and it was The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. The genre for this book is romance, and I always give a little synopsis of what the book's about in case you haven't read it. So PhD student Olive Smith gets herself into a bit of a sticky situation in a bid to prove to her best friend that she is like happy and fulfilled in her dating life. To do this, she kisses the first man she sees. Said man is Adam Carlson, young hotshot professor on campus that's known for being like really unfair and harsh in his grading. She's very surprised when he actually agrees to enter a fake dating arrangement with her. So I've read 2 books by Miss Ali. I've read Bride and what's the other one? Loath to Love You. It's like the trio of novellas that kind of offshoot off The Love Hypothesis. I think they take place like in the same universe. I think she's got a formula. They're formulaic, and do you know what? It's a formula that works for me. I know what I'm getting when I read a book by her and I enjoy it. I obviously enjoy the fact that the female main character is a woman in STEM. It's really nice to see a scientist as the romantic lead. I'm quite into sciencey stuff as well, so like even though from what I'd imagine, having like I've got like no academic background whatsoever, that it's probably like quite light touch science, it's still interesting. Like that's an interesting angle of it for me. It makes a change from a lot of the usual kind of romantic lead women being like in marketing or in something corporate. Sweet, quick and smart. I think I'm at the stage with Ali Hazelwood books where, because I know what I'm getting from them and I enjoy them, and I feel like her writing style and formula is distinctive enough to me that she's probably just going to end up as an author that's on my automatic read list. There was a couple of things that I didn't like about this book, and it was that the setup to the fake dating is absolutely absurd. In what world am I so desperate for my best friend to believe that I am happy and dating so that she goes out with my ex that I am not that interested in? Like, in what world am I having to convince her of that? And in what world am I avoiding telling her the truth? My best friend, I'm avoiding telling her the truth so badly that I just go out and kiss a random man without his consent. I don't know, at first I was like, what? But once I moved past that, it was fine. I don't particularly read a lot of these kinds of romance books because they're incredibly realistic. And then there's Adam, who I didn't love. Right, so like I get that he's this like asshole, stoic, broody type, and I understand like grumpy sunshine trope, but I'm starting to find these types of men quite dull. Is the quiet brooding a cover-up for how boring they are? I think there are so many well-rounded, like strong but silent, broody, stoic, broody's the wrong word, brooding, stoic, like grumpy with everyone except you characters out there that are written really well, and they do have like a lot of emotional depth to them, or they feel like well-rounded out characters. I can't name any right now, but I'm sure that there are. Obviously like he's fairly needy and like yearning and sexy when necessary, which kind of puts a bit of a plaster on it for me. If he's needy and begging, I can just about like get on board with it. But yeah, I think I'm just a little bit bored of this archetype of man. I've overdone the grumpy sunshine dynamic now. I need a man that's desperate. If anyone has any recommendations for romance where the man is more intense and engaged, like actively engaged in the relationship, please let me know, because I'm like so sick of the female main character just like tripling the word count of the man. Also, if she hadn't have kissed him, would he have ever said anything? The next book I listened to, this was an audiobook, and this was The Shadow Cabinet, which is Her Majesty's Royal Coven Book 2, and this is by Juno Dawson. Low urban fantasy, I'd say. This is the second installment in what I believe is going to be a trilogy, but I forgot to look it up. My previous review for the first book is in last month's book review, which I'll put in the description box. Unfortunately for this book, this will not be a spoiler-free review, just because it's like pretty impossible to reference the second book in a spoiler-free way without linking back to the events of the third. So I'll put the timestamp on screen of where you can skip forward to. So, book 2. Neve Kelly is dead, and her troubled twin Kira now occupies her body. She continues to masquerade as Neve as HMRC prepare to crown her as the High Priestess. That was quite a weak synopsis, admittedly, because there are quite a few different like storylines and angles happening in this book. But honestly, it was a weak synopsis for me because it was a weak book. Book 1 was very okay, and I was hoping for something a little bit more of the sequel. I did listen to book 1 as well, but I just felt quite disengaged from book 2. So we have even more point of views during this book, so more characters than ever before, which again, I've said is something that I struggle with quite a lot. I don't enjoy it in books when I feel like there's a lot of points of views from characters. It feels like we can't explore everyone's like experience fully. The second book was just missing something for me that the first book had, but not hugely. Like, so I didn't love the first book, but I enjoyed it, like it did the job. And I liked it enough to listen to the second. The first book ends on quite a big cliffhanger, as does the second. But it was just missing something that the first book had. It's almost like the events of the second book, where there's the inclusion of so many different characters now. And like geographically, the events become quite sprawling. Everyone's off doing like their own separate thing. And it feels like the events become like too big and too ridiculous. I said in my previous review that I wanted more from Leonie's character, and her character felt quite underexplored to me. And we had the addition of Leonie's POV in this book, which initially I was quite looking forward to, but I just wasn't interested in it at all. I felt like it really felt flat. She was hunting for Hale and it just felt strange. The characterization, which felt underexplored in book 1, just felt off in this book. It took like quite a turn. Lots of the characters I felt like were behaving in ways that didn't feel true to them, and I don't know if this was kind of to explore their depth and their duality and like show that people are capable of lots more things, but it just felt a bit inauthentic to the characters. The witch hunter twist for Luke, I mean, is no surprise. It's quite like a common trope in books about witches. So like Luke giving up Sheila like didn't feel right or becoming of his character at all, and Elle being so incredibly meek and mild, and then all of a sudden like flipping on Jeremy and turning him to stone, but also just accepting the Kira Neve thing when she seemed to me kind of like the goody two shoes. I'm not sure. I felt like some of the actions of the characters has completely like written off the characters in my eyes. I don't know if I'll engage with the third book. Also, Milo just literally being Lucifer was something that I wasn't expecting either, and not in a good way. I don't know. I'm not sure that I'll read the third book. I'm gonna see. It doesn't come out for a while, I don't think, but yeah, it just felt like a letdown and a bit of a slog, if I'm honest. The next book I read was another digital. This is one that's been on my TBR on Storygraph for like over a year, and it's such a short book, and I'm so glad I just like finally banged it out. It's The Salt Grows Heavy by Cassandra Core, and it's a horror book. So a bloodthirsty mermaid is on the run, and her companion is a plague doctor. Very mysterious companion. They don't seem to know much about each other. On their travels in a snowy, desolate forest, they eventually come across a village of very violent children and the 3 saints that control them. In order to survive, the mermaid and the plague doctor must embrace their true nature. So this was a super short, punchy read, about like 100 or so pages, 110 maybe. Been on my TBR for ages. Was really looking forward to reading this. Kind of like tried to save a lot of my spooky books for spooky season. I'm trying to integrate these like 100 pages I have all on my list, like between some of my longer reads, just as a quick like palette cleanser, I guess. Don't know if a horror can be a palette cleanser, but yeah. Should have been right up my street, and I'm not really sure what I think of it still. It's gonna be a bit of an up and down review because it was like incredibly verbose. I don't know if you can hear my neighbours upstairs. They're not that loud, but like it seems like it's quite loud, so sorry if it's picking up. Anyway, I got distracted. It was incredibly verbose, and there were some really obscure random words in there. For the most part, I'm not saying I know every single word out there, but I feel like I have a really good vocabulary internally, despite how oftentimes I speak and get my words jumbled up. I know most words, which sounds like a really stupid thing to say. I read a lot, so I think I have a good vocabulary, right? Despite what my verbal speech and grammar might imply. And it's not often that I come across words in a book that I've literally never seen before in my life. So I was quite surprised within like 20 pages of reading this. I was like having to look up quite a lot of words. I'm not really sure they added to the story. It felt after like the third or fourth one, like almost a bit pretentious, like a bit thesaurus vibes, but also like reading is hard. I don't know if potentially the language of the book was just too advanced for my like reading level. I sound like I'm in school, but you know what I'm trying to say. That bit aside, it was just something that stood out to me. It did take me a little minute to get into this very short book because you are essentially just like dumped into the middle of the plot. I felt very discombobulated when I started reading it, and like I needed to get my bearings. It was really hard to get my bearings, and because you know it's so short, you're like, what's going on? So it's a very grotesque book is exactly the word I would use to describe it. There is a lot of body horror going on in this book, some of which is like verging on like the fantastical, like beyond the realm of possibility. I'm not very squeamish, but I think if you are, I would probably just give it a miss, because there's a lot of like tummy and organ stuff that was like making me feel a bit ooh, like, you know, when your stomach churns. Alongside this is a lot of mutilation. This mermaid has really big sharp teeth and she loves eating people, so it like comes with the territory. I thought it was very cool, like dark horror, dark forest, had this kind of like Grimm's fairy tales element to me, like this dark gothic fairy tale vibe, which I quite enjoyed. Dark fantasy. The setting feels very like visually dark too. Dark forest, archaic belief, unable to pinpoint like what kind of time or era it's set in. I'm assuming like medieval vibes, but there was some fairly modern elements to it too. Definitely like Grimm's fairy tales adjacent. Overall, it was very much okay. I think if you're a horror fan, I would suggest reading it just because it is so short. It's just like another one to add to the roster. Short and mesmerizing. Mythical horror creatures, body horror, cannibalism, occult, all of those things right up my street. I think the reason it probably just didn't mesh with me is that maybe it was just a little bit too abstract. I'm starting to notice that books that I feel like are too abstract, I just don't really vibe with. I'm glad I'm like starting to recognize my style a bit more and what makes a good book for me. The next book I read was digital, and it was a fan fiction, and it was Manacled by author Senyin Liu. I've got a synopsis and then I'll do like a little disclaimer. So this is a fan fiction that is set in the Harry Potter universe. So this is post-war, Harry Potter's dead, Voldemort's won. Following the aftermath of the war, Voldemort sets up like a magical repopulation program. Hermione Granger is still alive and has an order secret like buried deep in her mind that no one can access, including herself. She is sent as an enslaved surrogate to Voldemort's right hand, the High Reeve, until she's pregnant and he can access the secret in her mind. So I'm gonna say now that this is an incredibly long review for me. Probably gonna be the longest one I've ever done, because I have so much to dissect and discuss about this book and so many thoughts, and it was such a long book. The reason it's so long is because I don't know anyone that's read this in real life, or I don't know anyone really online that I speak with regularly that's read it. So I haven't been able to talk about it much, and I feel like it's consumed me a little bit. This is a cathartic exercise for me. So what I'm gonna do is, this might not be your kind of thing. I'm gonna put the timestamp on the screen of when you can like skip to the next book. Anyway, this is my first fanfic I've ever read. I can't believe that I didn't have a fanfic phase. It feels very unlikely to me, because I was on Tumblr. I was on Tumblr from much too young of an age, and I was an avid reader, so I don't know how that era just passed me by. I think it's because my understanding during this time of fanfic and my experiences with fanfic had only ever been like One Direction fanfic. I thought that was basically like where it ended. I thought fanfic was only people writing about like musical stuff and music bands. I sound like an old person, you know what I mean? I wasn't a One Direction person, so it just like never really caught my eye. It was never on my radar. If you're thinking Manacled sounds like The Handmaid's Tale, you're absolutely correct. The author has said that it is heavily like inspired by watching The Handmaid's Tale. This is accessible on AO3, Archive of Our Own, until the end of the year because it's actually being published, which I'm going to talk about later in the review. So the end of 2024, it's available to download. So if you haven't downloaded it and you want a copy, I would recommend doing it now. I believe this is the most famous Dramini fanfic on AO3. I think it might be like the most downloaded or the most viewed. And I might go so far as to say I'm pretty sure it's like one of the most viewed fanfics on there ever. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm also not really a Dramini shipper, which is Draco and Hermione, so this is like completely new territory for me. This is going to be spoiler free right up until I say it's not. So if you've not read it and you're watching this part, I'll let you know when we're going to spoil it. I am not a massive Harry Potter fan. I grew up with Harry Potter. I read all of the Harry Potters as they came out. I really loved the books. I love the films a bit, but I feel like I've overdone them. I've watched them all so many times, and I'm not a Harry Potter adult. You know, there's Harry Potter adults and then there's like Disney adults and stuff as well. Not either of those like brackets derogatory, but like I'm just not that involved. Like I've never been to the places that you go. I don't engage with any of like the offshoot stuff like Fantastic Beasts or anything like that. The magic of the books was a little bit ruined for me when we learned about J.K. Rowling's transphobia. So as a result, I just personally haven't been keen to line her pockets with any more money by engaging in like it as a franchise now. But I think that's also why I enjoyed reading Manacled so much, because it was an immersion into a universe that I hadn't been a part of for so long. It felt very nostalgic for me. I'm going to try break it into parts. We're going to firstly talk about like the emotions, my emotions, the emotional impact of the book, like the emotionality of it all, because that's the thing that's like freshest in my mind. I'm going to skip discussing characterization because I want to keep this as short and concise as I possibly can, and there's not really huge amounts that I have to say about that. Not anything that's adding to the conversation in a meaningful way anyway. After that, I'm going to talk about content, world building, the writing, the plot, all of that kind of stuff. And then afterwards, we're going to discuss it being published. Then I'm going to discuss the ending, but I'll tell you about spoilers. It's fine. We've got this. This review is led solely by my emotions. I've been so desperate to discuss this book, and so many people were messaging me about it, asking like if it's worth reading, like would I recommend it? And I still don't really have an answer to that. Just before I read this, I was almost a bit of reaching a reading slump. I wanted a romance, but I wanted a deep and desperate romance that transcends dimensions of time. I wanted a deep and passionate and yearning and heartbreaking romance. I wanted devotion and desire and obsession. I wanted like ground earth shattering, heartbreaking, life altering romance. The kind of people that are destined to be together in every lifetime. I wanted that. I needed some of that. And now that I've had it, you can have it back. You can have it back. I don't want it anymore. I wanted something that was difficult, and I wanted something that really made me feel, and I got it. Be careful what you wish for. So it's very dark. It's very uncomfortable reading at times. If anyone's watched or read The Handmaid's Tale, you'll kind of know what I'm alluding to. Going back to Manacled, I think what I didn't expect about Manacled was that the book would get so dark so quickly. What was difficult for me, I think, having never previously read any Harry Potter fanfic, was remembering that the characters in the book now are about 20 plus. And it was really, really hard for me at first to move on from the fact that they weren't still in school anymore and that it wasn't school kids. I was like really like, oh my God. And then I realized they're all 20s plus, they're all adults. Ultimately, I think this is a story about war. It's a very, very deep dive on like the psychological effects of war, like during and post-war, long-term grief, and like all of the emotional problems that are caused as a result of participating and being victims in a war. I'm a very emotional person, so I think I got quite easily sucked into the kind of like emotional threads of the book. As horrifying and as bleak as you would expect a story about war to be, and there are a few happy moments despite it all, but I did find myself getting quite lost in the story, like in a good way, like lost in the story, but I think it took quite like an emotional toll on me. I didn't really realize how emotionally invested I was, and because I was just like plodding along reading it, right? And like I mentioned, like I'm not that invested in the Harry Potter universe, so I didn't feel like I had an automatic like affinity or connection to these characters. It was only when I was about like halfway to 3/4 of the way through reading that I realized I was reading it with like bated breath and so much tension in my body, because I was getting like emotional whiplash from it. I was expecting one thing to happen, then another thing would happen, and you basically just like go back and forth, and there's so much tension throughout. It felt like I was genuinely expecting the worst case scenario throughout like the whole book. I was just expecting everything to come crashing down. And that's not giving anything away, but that's like no way to live. That just shows you how tense it is for so long. I read it very, very fast because honestly, I wanted to get it over with. Like I wanted to see the back of this book, which I kind of regret doing now because I wish I'd luxuriated and savored it a bit more. But like emotionally, I couldn't take it. And I didn't actually check the page count before downloading it. It's 1,700 pages, 1,700 pages. I didn't know. I read it in 5 days. There was a lot of late nights that week. I did not feel good. I was staying up till like 2, 3 a.m. and forcing myself to sleep. Yeah, I wish I'd taken my time with it a bit more because I don't think I'll ever read this book again. Like if I'm completely honest, I just don't think I can. And it's not even that it's just like an emotional story, but it's like constantly linking back to this war and like morally grey is like not even the correct phrase, but you're constantly questioning because of war, like what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable during a war. Like nothing is as straightforward as you think. Morally grey is like an understatement of the century, but I know that that's the intention. That in itself, that like constant questioning is like emotionally taxing. This book is divisive for a lot of people, and a lot of people obviously can't enjoy it because of the content and the subject matter, or like don't feel like they want to read it. Maybe enjoy it is the wrong turn of phrase, and I really, really respect that boundary because there were certain points in the book that I was reading that I was like, I can't see a way out of this. Like I can't see how we're gonna get to the end of the book. I saw so many people loved it and I couldn't see the pathway that the author was gonna take me on to get me to the point that people who had read it were at. I like didn't understand how we were gonna get there. Emotions out the way. I was quite impressed with the world building. Of course, the world building isn't set up by the author in this instance. J.K. Rowling like laid the groundwork for the successful world building. She's laid the bricks, as it were. Maybe it's because I'm new to fanfic, but I feel quite impressed at the level of knowledge and attention to detail anyone would have to write about their chosen universe in such detail. Like I said, it could be that I'm quite easily impressed because it's been so long since I was in the HP universe in any format. My first journey into any kind of like alternate universe fanfic. So my Harry Potter trivia isn't great, so maybe I'm just, yeah, maybe the threshold for being impressed is really low. Although there must have been things that the author covered in great detail that weren't covered in great detail in the books. I haven't phrased that very well, but things like medical magic, magical pregnancy, I'd never know how to say this word, but like legilimens, I think. Legilimency. I'd be really interested to see what you think if you've read this and you feel like you're really clued up on the lore, and if you agree with me that it felt knowledgeable and well written around those kinds of things, like the extras, the ancillaries as it were, or at least well thought out and executed. I don't know, maybe my standards are just like really low. The pacing was very slow. Obviously it's such a long book, so this is kind of like expected, and it is written in a way that there's a lot of foreshadowing. Like a third of the book is flashbacks, and there's lots of different links to things, and there's so many like little parallels running throughout the book, which I thought was a really nice touch. There's like lots of referencing of things, you know, like he does this and then he does this and then he does this, and you see it and it's kind of brought up in quite a subtle way, but you picked it up because there was a few moments where I was like, oh, I've read that exact sentence. And I don't mean like an easy sentence to repeat, like she sat up, but there was like turns of phrase and stuff that I noticed, and I just thought that was a really nice touch. It like linked everything together. Obviously can't think of any tangible examples right now. I'm not a great reviewer, but I was able to figure out where the story was going quite early on. I don't know if that's intentional or not. It didn't take away from my reading experience in a disruptive way. I do have the blinders on a little bit for this book in terms of the emotional impact it had on me. I'll say it. If you've watched my channel before, you'll know what I'm trying to say, but if this is the first video you've ever seen of mine, I would consider myself a vibe reviewer. I review books more leaning towards the emotional impact they had on me and like the vibe they gave me and my enjoyment of them. And I know that sounds really obvious given that everyone reviews everything relative to them, but I find my emotional judgment is happy to overlook a lot of writing issues. This doesn't mean I'm scared to review books badly. It just means that when I'm reading for entertainment, so specifically with fiction as well, I tend to be a bit more forgiving towards arguably bad writing or content that is questionable. when I'm emotionally invested in a book. I'm not saying that this is the case here. I just say it sounds like I don't have like a lot of bad things to say about this book, because at the moment I don't. I finished this book early in October and I've had quite a long time to like sit with my thoughts about it as well. I've never read a fanfic, and from what I was expecting, I think this one's pretty well written. Having read the reviews of Manacled, the discussion around it seems to remind me of a lot of the discussion that was happening around A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara, and whether it was like a good book or not, or just trauma porn. They are two completely different books, but a lot of the discussion around both books is it necessary? Like, why would anyone write this? Like, why would someone think this up? And most importantly, like, why would readers enjoy this? There's comments about rape and violence being packaged unnecessarily as harrowing storytelling, and I don't really know how to have that discussion, or if I feel like equipped to have that discussion. I really wish I had the verbiage and like the media analysis skills to be able to not only form a coherent opinion, but to like present to you my coherent opinion on how I feel about traumatic events like rape and violence being used in excess as like an accessory to the plot, specifically in books. I fear I never will, you know. I want to like read more about it, so if anyone has any like essays or articles about it, I'm just like keen to absorb as much information as I can about it, because I still don't know how I feel about it, and I fear I never will, and I fear in this specific context it's not black and white. And of course I mean it's not black and white specifically in a book context. I mentioned this earlier, but I found it really difficult to read in the beginning because I kept forgetting they are not kids in this universe, and I really struggled as well because I kept picturing the actors in the role. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but like I don't think Tom Felton is fit at all. Like, sorry, no offense. Blonde men like aren't really my thing. I'm not really into him, with the exception of the Half-Blood Prince movie. I don't find him particularly like sexy, intimidating or dangerous. Like, to me he couldn't say boo to a goose, so to see him as this like actual lethal weapon was just I really wasn't convinced. I'm like trying to imagine him towering over me, like really scary and sexy, but like I'm pretty sure I tower over him. It took me a little while to get past like that version of Draco in my head, but once we got there, we got there. One thing about the writing, very small thing, but it significantly took me out the story, is that it felt really consistent in the writing, in that it was like this believably British universe. It was pretty convincing in terms of the writing in that sense, until the author referred to something as weighing in pounds. We don't use pounds in the UK, and that is such a teeny tiny little thing, but that was the moment where I was like, oh okay, the author's not British. I like knew instantly straight away from that. Silly small thing, but yeah. Last thing about the content, I think this is, again, quite a small thing. I don't know whether this is the norm in fan fiction, but I really enjoyed the author's notes. There was author notes at the beginning of a lot of chapters, not all of them, but just a little bit of like context, and it really made me and helped me to enjoy the story. A lot of them obviously contain trigger warnings for like more troubling parts of the books, which I really appreciated, and I think a lot of readers will appreciate as well, because it does, like I said, get very dark very quickly and very graphic. It just added a lot to my reading experience. It reminds me of, you know, when you watch like the actor's commentary on a movie or the director's commentary. It felt like reading margins in like someone's notebook. It was a nice touch, and it was also paired with a lot of beautiful fan art. And you know what, I'm not really like a fan art person. I don't really go searching like too often for fan art, but I think it just really helped like visualize the scenes, and it was nice to have the option. It also helped move me away from Tom Felton in my head. This review is so long, so I'm gonna discuss publishing. So this is being published in autumn 2025. Really happy for her. Amazing achievement for the author, because imagine, it must feel long overdue. I know people don't write fanfic to get published. People write it because of their love of writing and their love of that universe, if it's alternate universe. But I can't imagine anyone ever thought it was going to be as popular as it was. And imagine writing like a 1,700 page book essentially, and it being like so popular, and obviously you can just never earn a dime off of it because of intellectual property. So yeah, that's why it's coming off AO3 at the end of the year. It's being renamed to Alchemized, and at first I was curious as to like how she would rewrite it, because obviously it's like set in the Harry Potter universe. And then I remembered actually that loads and loads and loads of successful books started off as fanfics, like 50 Shades, The Love Hypothesis. I mean, there's obviously more. I just can't think of any right now, but let me know if you know of any more, because I think it's always really fun to hear about like their origin story. There's loads on the author's Tumblr about how she's planning to rewrite it, and she puts it much more eloquently than I ever could and explains like kind of a bit behind the process. It must be a really exciting opportunity to rewrite like a new magical world and a new magical system and write something from the ground up, and I'm hoping it will allow her writing to thrive a bit more, because I felt like she was a good writer. I don't think I'm gonna read it when it comes out. I just don't think I can do it to myself again. We're going to enter the spoiler section of this discussion now. We're going to discuss a little bit more about publishing, because there's something related that I want to kind of sound out, and then we're going to discuss the ending. So again, I'll put the timestamp on the screen of where you can skip to the next book. Sorry, I feel so bad. This is so long. I'll give you a couple of seconds to get away. I'm really interested to see how, when Alchemize is published, how she handles it as a writer and how the reader handles it. I don't know how to word it succinctly, so I'm just gonna go and get to the point. So currently when you read Manacled, right, you have a pre-established community of readers that love Draco Malfoy. As a character in the original books and in the fan fiction community, Draco Malfoy has fans, right? He does really, 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 really bad and terrible things in this book. A lot of people do, but this is about Draco. He does really bad things before the war, during the war, after the war, in the name of protecting himself, in the name of protecting people, as a victim of the war. Like, the whole crux of this book, right, is that they're all victims, some more than others, but they are all victims. That's not me excusing his actions, I'm just saying. He is literally presented to us and packaged to us as someone that rapes and someone that murders, amongst lots of other horrible war crimes. He's a war criminal, right? He's also our main romantic protagonist, if romantic is even the correct word, because it's something more akin to devastating devotion and obsession. I think that it is an easier pill for people to swallow because we have the previous context of Draco Malfoy. We have 7 books where we grow up with Draco. We've got 7 movies where we grow up with Draco. There's all this universe, all this lore. So before we even meet him in this evil context, we have like a preconceived characterization of who he is, and with that comes a pre-existing community of people that love Draco Malfoy, would go to war for Draco Malfoy, that ship Draco and Hermione already from the offset. People like them together before we even read this. All of this to say that I'm wondering if, because of this, it is easier for the reader to feel more connected and empathize with the High Reeve, with Draco's character. I'm curious to see how the reader of Alchemized, a reader who might not know that it's originally based on a fan fiction, will experience the redemption arc of the High Reeve removed from the context in which it like is currently existing. Does that make sense? I talked around that in such a big spiral because I didn't know how to make that more tight. It's easier to fall in love with someone when you've got their history, right? Whereas this High Reeve is just gonna be a guy that we know that does terrible things. We will still have his like redemption. I don't know if redemption's the right word, because does he ever really redeem himself? But there's not that connection. I'm really interested to see if the reader will be less forgiving because his actions are just so dark. Anyway, let's talk about the big finish, the ending. One thing that's terrible about me is when I get to the end of a book, my reading speed really, really picks up. It's usually because I'm reading late into the night and I need to finish it. I start skipping words, I start skim reading. I already am a really fast reader, so my reading speed getting any faster is like untenable, because then I start losing comprehension. And especially with this book, I wanted to see the back of it, I wanted to finish it. It was too much for me. And I finished it at like 3 AM. I cried silently for like half an hour, and then I didn't sleep till 4 because I was just processing. Mainly from shock and emotional whiplash, that's why I was crying. I knew it was a devastating ending because I'd seen some stuff online previously about it, but I didn't actually know how it ended. And all throughout the last quarter of the book, this was in my mind. So if I'm honest, I'd really prepped myself for the fact that one of them would die. And I had no idea who it was gonna be. I swung wildly between thinking it was gonna be Draco or Hermione. So by the time I actually got to the end, I was just so relieved that they were both alive that in my head, I was like, happy ending. My immediate reaction was, neither of them died. This is better than I was expecting. This is a happy ending, good night. So I went to sleep, and the next day I was thinking about it and I was processing. And I was just like, couldn't stop thinking about it all day. And I started to have this sinking feeling that I don't think this was a happy ending. I started to have the sinking feeling that maybe not to die is not a happy ending. And that this was not a happy ending, but even worse, a realistic ending. It was the best ending they could get, but not the ending they deserved. And for that, it was an unhappy ending. I think that's what was so heartbreaking about it. And it like, I had a death by 1,000 cuts, do you know what I mean? They are both so broken and so lost and like shells of their former self, and like really traumatized that I don't know if it's happy. They live in secret, like her efforts go unacknowledged. He's basically in fucking witness protection because he's a war criminal. They'll both be tried for their war crimes. And that last line is like a real punch in the gut. And I guess that's the real tragedy of it all, right? It's like they got what they wanted, but at what cost? And it wasn't really like the full lived version of what they wanted. But at the same time, I think I might appreciate that than any of the alternatives, because like one of them dies, which I just could not face. They both die, which just would have felt so sad. Or they all have an unrealistically happy ending, which is just out of character for the book. All of it feels just so fucking unjust, and I know that that's the point. And in the last 150 pages, I felt fucking unsafe, bro. Like, I did not feel good. I was feeling tense. I was so scared for them. I did not feel like they were safe at any point. And I think that's when I realized the subtle creeping of like the emotional journey that the author had taken me on, was that I felt so like unsettled and unrested and like unable to think that they were ever safe or believe that they were safe. I just had whiplash because it felt like from the start the rug was ripped out from under us as a reader consistently and constantly. In summary, I felt very emotionally wrung out when I finished this book. Book hangover was in full force. It was really just on my mind for days. Do I recommend it? I don't know. Do I like it? I don't know. Will I ever reread it? Probably not. I think it came at the right time because I was wanting and needing and desiring a book that really made me feel, and I wanted immersion and I wanted desperation and I wanted really fucking big feelings. And yeah, be careful what you wish for, because that's what I got. You can decide whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I was just reviewing that book for so long. Like, you know that. I know that. But I'm a little bit worried the sun's gonna go down. It's 2:30 and it's already getting really dark. The next book I read was another audiobook. Sorry, it's a bit boring for you all. It's another fan fiction. It's called Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal of Being in Love. It's a proper mouthful, and it's by an AO3 writer called Bridgie Knightley. Their handle is this self-care? This is another Draco Hermione fan fiction, and I'm going to give you the synopsis and then I'm going to explain why I read it. So Hermione Granger is involved in both the magical and the non-magical world as a medical researcher and a very well-established healer. She's on the verge of some quite important medical research breakthrough in the magical world, and Draco Malfoy is assigned as an aura to protect her because there's some kind of like unknown force trying to hinder her research and put her in danger, much to their mutual disdain. They don't like each other. So yeah, this is another fan fiction, but hear me out. I was in a bad way after reading Manacled, and when I was like looking on Reddit, I was just like reading what people think of it. A lot of people said that a really good pairing to read after Manacled was Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal of Being in Love. I can't say that again. They advise it as a pairing to follow that book because this is such a light, fluffy rom-com that it works in like an effort to diffuse the tension and to kind of almost have a better ending. And do you know what? I will say, to their credit, I was really hesitant to pick this up. I hadn't read anything in a few days because I couldn't get out of that funk. And I read it and it absolutely did the fucking job. It really worked. It left me on a much more positive note, definitely lightened the mood. And this is what I would say is a very typical classic like rom-com book. Slow burn, forced proximity, lots of pining, yearning, like male desperation, which we love, and a little bit of action and adventure as well, which is quite nice. It is a very stark difference to Manacled. Lots of witty banter, lots of moments that are intended to make you laugh. Very sweet and very cheeky. What I needed was a light book, and I needed to see them live out a lovely light romance, and that is exactly what I got. One thing I quite liked about this as well is that they're in their 30s. I know it sounds really silly, but obviously as I grow up, I am much more enjoying my romantic leads in books to be in their kind of like early to mid 30s rather than their 20s. I'm still barely in my 20s. But yeah, I've noticed myself more actively enjoying a romance where the characters are 30 plus. I did think at points it was perhaps a bit cringe, but that's not always a bad thing. And the cringe for me was more related into what I felt like was more over the top like Britishisms in the writing. Do you know what, the writing style and like the word choice and the sentence structure like really felt a bit like Bridget Jones-esque to me. I couldn't actually find out anywhere if the author was British or American, but when I read books like that, it always makes me think that the author isn't British. If I'm wrong about that, really sorry about that, but it's things like overuse of the word snogging. Like, you can't blame me. No one says snog. No one says snog when they're in their 30s. Sorry if you do, but like no one says it seriously, right? Getting myself into a hole here, but I'd never be like, fancy a snog. It's like so over the top in that sense, with its like one-liners and its like British turns of phrase and its cheekiness, that it kind of like verges on satirical. So once you kind of accept that, it is really enjoyable. It plays into this like light rom-com energy unapologetically. I also enjoy a super mega super long slow burn, and this was definitely that. There was a lot of like unresolved sexual tension, which is like right up my street. I don't like it when they get on too quickly. Would I have read this if it wasn't as a follow-up to my previous read? Probably not. Was it very cleansing and somewhat healing for me? Yes. If you read Manacled, I would really recommend that you follow up with this if you feel bereft. Enough Harry Potter. On to my next book, which was a physical book, but I don't have it with me because I returned it to the library. It was Private Rites by Julia Armfield. This is a queer fiction book, and I'm gonna really light touch brackets so it's horror. But in a world where it endlessly rains, like life and society has reshaped itself quite significantly. Queer sisters Irene, Agnes and Isla have not spoken in quite a long time when they all get the call that their fathers died. Cruel father, esteemed architect, they all come together in his house to sort through his will and the memories of him. So this was probably my most anticipated book of the year. I am a really big Julia Armfield fan. I've really enjoyed Our Wives Under the Sea. It's literally one of my favourite books, probably easily in my top 5, and I really enjoyed Salt Slow as well. I love her writing and it's so distinct to me, and unfortunately I placed too much weight on this book and my expectations were too high, and that altogether really contributes as to why I feel like this book fell really flat for me. I've annoyed myself with that. And I think it's also probably a stretch to say that this is horror. I love the setting. Julia Armfield has such a way of writing about water. I have never seen anyone that likes water as much as Julia Armfield does. God, she has such a way of writing about it. It is endlessly damp. Foundations of skyscrapers and flat blocks are crumbling. You can't get fresh vegetables because it rains all the time, there's no sun. You can't drive, air travel is like impossible. And yet people want normality. People are still attempting to go to work. People are still attempting to go clubbing. People still want their daily morning coffee. They persevere. There is such an unsettling urgency to the rain in this book. And the general tone of like the city that it's set in and the climate crisis actually gave me quite a lot of anxiety. It's just something like dank and gloomy about the writing. It's so melodic and rhythmic and unsettling, literally like ocean waves. It's what I loved about Our Wives, and it's what I enjoyed reading about Private Rites. I don't know how else to describe it, but it's watery. When I read this as well, it had been raining for about a week with no end in sight, and it was making me feel so like damp and claustrophobic, and I could feel like the moisture in the air, and I felt like really oppressed by it. So it was a very immersive reading experience. Horrid and spectacular. As always, like I will say, her writing is incredibly atmospheric. But however, this is such a strong character focused book, which we all know that I sometimes struggle with. It felt like minimal plot and entirely vibes. We learn so much about the three sisters, their romantic relationships, their relationships to themselves in relation to each other, their partners, their family, and we're like kind of fed these little snippets every now and then between chapters of descriptions of how they live in the city. So I felt really randomly captivated every now and then, but it lost me quite quickly at points before it picked me back up. I gave myself a little bit of a break about halfway through and didn't pick it up for a week or two, just because I thought, you know what, let me just reset, because I was starting to feel like really disengaged when I was reading it. And dare I say it, I just think that this was too subtle for me, almost too subtle when I look at her previous works that I really enjoyed, but I know we're not supposed to really be comparing them, but I just wasn't prepared for that. I wasn't prepared for the subtlety. There are hints and some things laid down throughout the book that nod towards the ending that she does. I still felt like the ending came out of nowhere for me. Maybe they were just too subtle for me to pick up. The last 50 pages to me felt really disconnected from the rest of the book. I'm going to assume though that that is obviously just because there's clearly a lot of stuff I didn't pick up. Overall, I thought that there was some beautiful writing, but it was a bit of a slog for me. But I will say my opinion on my reading experience has been hugely skewed by the fact that I put too high of an expectation on this book, so I'm blaming myself in this instance. The next book I read was a physical book, and I got it out from the library, and I thought I had it with me, but I don't know where it is. So I'll just put a picture up on the screen, but it's Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I'm going to assume it's Piranesi, not Piranesi. This is a fiction, like literary fiction maybe, like kind of like fantastical fiction. Piranesi's house is a labyrinth surrounded by the ocean. Endless corridors, infinite rooms, bottomless chambers, all filled with marble statues, all completely different. Tidal patterns flooding rooms, waves crashing up the floor. He loves and he respects the house, and he diarizes it in his like endless exploration of each room. There is another person in the house known as the Other, whom Piranesi meets with twice a week to aid him in his research of a secret and great knowledge, as he calls it. When Piranesi is exploring one day, he finds evidence of another person, a third person, and secrets start to unravel and unfold, and everything just starts to crumble. I'm still unsure about my feelings for this book. It has really, really great reviews, and when I posted that I was reading it, a lot of you said it's like one of your favorite books, like it's amazing. And it has the formula for me of a 5-star read, but for some reason it's just not. Kind of fantastical, kind of cool, kind of Greek, insidious, looming undertone, beautiful visual descriptions of the house and the labyrinth and the statues and the water. I felt very wrapped up in the visual elements of the book and the descriptions, and they were endless descriptions of vestibules and tunnels and hallways and rooms. You know me as well, I love to get wrapped up in the visuals, but for some reason it just didn't have that wow factor for me that it seemed to have for everyone else. That's not to say I didn't enjoy it, because I did, and I'm glad I read it, but I just about halfway through felt myself disengage. Not sure why, because everyone seemed like super captivated with it, but it just didn't hold me in the same way. I think the intention of this book is to take you on a ride, more importantly Piranesi's ride. We are just dropped into this house, we do not know where we are. It's meant to keep us confused. It's meant to keep us confused while we gather our bearings and establish where we are, and I think it's intentionally hazy at points and intentionally repetitive while you figure out what's going on. It's incredibly descriptive. Like I said earlier, there is just endless descriptions of seemingly the same thing in a slightly different area. Long and thorough descriptions, and you might hate that. I think a lot of people did hate it, but I quite enjoyed it. I like the visuals. It kind of gives me like liminal space vibes, you know, the back rooms. I do think maybe the repetition and like the intentional confusion did stop me feeling like as connected to the story as I could have. I love a good world building, so it didn't take me that long to connect to the book. I'm not sure I understand the hype, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that I feel it's overhyped. If you like this book, I think you'll like, if you loved this book, I think you would like A Short Stay in Hell by Stephen L. Peck. That's one of my favourite books, and it did really remind me of that. It's got like a similar vibe. It's about a man that's in purgatory, but purgatory is like an endless library with endless corridors. Like it just keeps going, but he decides to explore the library. No end, no beginning. It's about 100 pages, so I recommend it. Right, it's progressively getting darker and we're losing light, and we still have 2 books to review. These 2 I didn't get around to making notes for last night, so this is a physical book. This is 19 Claws and a Blackbird, and this is by Agostina Bazterrica. This is a short story collection, and this is horror. So I read this in my most recent reading bookish vlog. I got it out from the library. This is a horror short story collection. This is by the author of Tender is the Flesh. I've wanted to read this for a while, and I love a horror short story collection, although I feel like short story collections, people either really like them or they really don't, and I'm in the camp of I love short stories. I think they're great, because if you're reading one you don't like it, it's over really quickly. Overall, my thoughts on this is that I don't really like to describe the book as a bit mid, but that's how I felt. Like it was a bit mid. I didn't love it, I didn't hate it. I felt like the quality of the short stories yo-yoed so drastically. There's quite a lot of short stories in here, and some of them are only like a page long. My kind of grading for short stories about whether I enjoy the collective book as a whole is ratioed on how many of them I like versus how many of them I don't like. And in this case, I felt that so many of them were very unmemorable, and there was only a few standouts. There is a good range of horror in here. There is some psychological horror, there's some body horror, quite a lot of body horror. If Tender as a Flesh is anything to go by, it's quite similar and it's quite gory at points. There's that kind of fear of the unknown thing going on. So there's a good variety. Yeah, variety and themes explored, good variety. It starts with a real shock factor, and it comes across that like the stories are kind of slightly paired by theme. The first story in the book is like quite graphic and quite shocking, and I was a bit open-mouthed by it just because I wasn't expecting it to launch like that. I think a lot of short story collections kind of put the openers as the most shocking ones or the best ones. Julia Armfield's horror short story collection, Salt Slow, I've got that. I enjoyed more of the stories in that than I didn't enjoy them, whereas this I felt it was the other way around. It wasn't even that I didn't enjoy them, it's just they felt a bit unmemorable to me. Some of the ones I enjoyed in here, I enjoyed Perfect Symmetry. It's about a woman that wants to become a circle, so she like ingests only round foods and like starts to cut things off her body so that she's perfectly spherical. I liked Unamuno's boxes. The solitary ones was kind of scary. It's about a woman on a train at night, just terrifying generally. Mary Carmen was one that I would have liked to read as a full-length book. The Woman Who Wants to Be a Circle, I got that wrong. It's not perfect symmetry, it's the continuous equality of the circumference. But yeah, that's what I thought of that. Final book before we get entirely and utterly pitch black for the evening. My last book was a digital book, and it was Migrations by Charlotte McConaughey. So I originally got Migrations out from the library and the font was too small, so I returned it and got it on Kindle. Fiction, science fiction, question mark, loosely. Oh, Franny Stone is the kind of woman that is able to love but unable to stay put. She arrives in Greenland with nothing but her research gear and embarks on a journey to track the migration of the last ever existing Arctic terns. She talks her way onto a fishing boat, and as she follows the terns, she kind of comes to face the reality of what it is she's running away from. Fuck me, I think this might be the favourite book I've read this year. Dare I say it? I know the year is young, she says in November, but I think this might be my favourite book I've read this year. Jesus Christ. Firstly, the setting is just like so harrowing. It's like really made me want to go entirely vegan and not eat fish because I'm pescatarian, and basically the world in the not too distant future, like 80% of all animal species have died off, and there's no more fish in the sea, which is why there's no more birds, and that's why she's following what she believes is the last migration of Arctic terns and possibly their final migration, because they won't find any fish, so they'll all die. It is so emotional and it is so heart-wrenching, and I think again it crept up on me. I wasn't quite expecting it. You don't feel a lot towards Franny Stone at the beginning, and I love the dual timeline in this case, which is not usually something I really love, but it's kind of flits between Greenland present day and the Arctic Circle, and then Ireland and Franny's life in Ireland and her life previously in Australia. The extinction of animals is like the new normal. I've seen a lot of reviews online that people are fairly unhappy that this wasn't explored more, which I completely understand, because those were the bits that initially roped me in. I was desperate to find out what had happened. A lot of people felt like there wasn't enough discussion and kind of like world building around what the true impact of losing animals is and how this would actually affect humanity. I think people just didn't feel like the science was explored enough, because it kind of seemed glossed over. It was like convenient to fit the book, but actually the environmental impact of that happening would be completely and utterly devastating. And we get thrown a few bones about how you have to like book to visit beaches, but we're not hearing much about how like vegetables and fruit and fresh food are becoming inaccessible, which is what would happen. But anyway, that's kind of what the main criticism of the book is, that people feel the scientific angle isn't explored enough. I didn't really feel like that was the case for me, just because I enjoyed the book so much. If you are someone that is quite like sucked into the science and the details of books, that might bother you. Franny's mother was born with the strong urge to wander, and like so was Franny, and I loved and like resonated to some degree, maybe not to quite an extent that it happened to Franny, but I resonate so deeply with this like unbearable pull to the ocean, and like to be free and to be like a wanderer and to be nomadic in your lifestyle. And then Franny like all of a sudden is doing this one last big wander, and just as the story unravels, I kind of hate her at the beginning. I don't know, not hate her, but she's just kind of, you're like, what's going on? You don't really understand her, and obviously you're just fed more and more information. Like her sense of doom and like sadness is like so deep throughout the whole book. I loved this book. It filled me with such, oh, I've actually got goosebumps talking about it. It filled me with such a horrible sense of sadness, and when I closed it, I cried for like an hour, but good God, it was just so moving. And like, I love birds. I don't really share that very much. I love the ocean, I love birds, and like her obsession with birds and the length at which the book discussed birds. Has anyone ever read or watched Jonathan Livingston Seagull? It's like one of my favourite books and movies. I read it when I was younger. My mum showed it to me for the first time, and it was like really, really depressing, but I loved it, and that's just the kind of person I am. It's like an ethical journey, it's like an emotional journey, it's a big old fucking journey. I think what a lot of the criticism is about like the plausibility of it and the hows and the whys, and I do think at some points there was a moment where it like bordered on, I was like, well, how is this happening? What is going on? But I still enjoyed it because I think I was so immersed, and I just found it so haunting. One of my lifelong dreams is to go on an Arctic cruise, you know, the really small ones, but they're like literally £10,000 ticket. But I often think, even if I had the money, well, I will have the money because we're manifesting, but by the time I have the money, is it ethical to go on an Arctic cruise? Like, should that part of the world just be like left well alone, you know? I don't really want to go. I'm spending hypothetical money I don't have. I really liked it, and I think I'm fully in my emotions about this book to the point that I like overlook all the bad parts about it. So that's just where I am. But anyway, that is me done. But anyway, that's all I have to say about it really, because I didn't write any notes from it, so I don't have much more constructiveness about it. Anyway, that was all the books I read for October. Sorry about the ever-fading light. I should have gotten up earlier to record, but I was being slow today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll put all my socials in the description box. As always, I'd love to hear your book suggestions. We only have 2 more reading wrap-ups for the rest of the year. I didn't tell you my total of books that I've read for the year. So far, I have read, at the time of recording this, I've read 75, but I think in October it would have been 71 or 72. But let me know what you thought of today's books, and I apologise so deeply that this has been such a long and taxing video. I don't even know what it will be at by the time I'm done editing. Thanks for listening to me ramble on about Hermione fanfic. It was really good to get it off my chest. I don't use Goodreads, but you can add me on Storygraph. And yeah, if you like my book content, please follow my BookTok account. Have a lovely evening or daytime or morning whenever you're watching this.